It really is the silly season because only in a silly season would you get articles being run about the fact that Tories are now once again desperate to go and hit the Boris button, thinking that once again Boris Johnson surely must be the only guy who can save them. Which again, not going to be very good if we're quite honest. Let's face it. Um, Bringing back Boris Johnson or attempt to bring back Boris Johnson at this point, probably very, very much so doomed to failure. Not only that, how would the rest of, should we say, the British voting public actually react to like a Boris Johnson comeback? I don't think they would be reacting too favorably. Of course, remember, Partygate still in a lot of people's minds. The COVID inquiry still ongoing. Still ongoing. I think it's got I think it's like what, a year and a half, another year or something like that to go before I think it fully finishes. And then of course you've got the final report. What's that gonna be like? um Meanwhile, of course, the Tories are still in this vein. Kemi Badenoch is, I think, again, as we've said many times before, in a very, very bad position of her own making. Um, I don't know how honestly she expects to survive. I will be incredibly not shocked if they don't make a move against her sometime this autumn, maybe winter, maybe even, dare I say, at the conference, because that this year's Tory conference could get quite fun if that decides to happen. Then that will be very fun indeed. But in the meantime, we're gonna have a look at this. This call once again. From, of course, the favorite, my favorite comedy website online, the Conservative Home, what they are making all of this about the returning or the yearning for the return of Boris Johnson. So, as always, before we do get out into this, please remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button down below. Of course, there are links to my Patreon page, the Buy Me Coffee link, the YouTube thank you button, and of course, as always, there's the YouTube membership down below as well. So thank you very much to those people who do help and support the channel that way. So let's crack on then into this. So the return of Boris. Tory voters are now looking back to the future. So political parties can be creatures of habit. The Conservative Party's recent habit is now looking backwards when certain about the future. That much, of course, is very clear from voters' new Ipsos polling poll exclusively provided to Conservative Home on the Conservative leadership. Should Kemi Badenoch falter, Boris Johnson is now the clear favourite amongst those who voted Conservative in 2024. Why on earth would you make Boris Johnson your clear favourite in 2024? I don't know why, when the rest of your electorate would look at that and be like, you know? Anyway, so Boris Johnson's still the favourite. In return, they are trying to, of course, save the party now from its post-election despair, with 24% of them say they would have him now back in charge, well ahead of James Cleverly, and even Rishi Sunak at 14 and 12%. It is, of course, on the level extraordinary. Johnson was ousted in a scandal, toppled by colleagues who swore blind that his premiership had become electorally toxic. And 2 years on, with the Conservatives now reduced to near rubble, these very same voters now see him as the figure who could lead them again. I've said this before in the past. One thing that if a Conservative leader is to ever actually come and try and sort out the party, it's not just MPs, it's not just absolutely trashing their ideology or anything like that. It's what do you do about the membership? Because the membership has gone absolutely, bananas, and you need to sort them out at some point. That would be part of, I think, the massive cleanup process. Probably any successful conservative leader would have to do, and it is a huge undertaking to try and solve that. I don't think there's anyone who out there could generally do that. That's why I keep on saying I think the Conservative Party is donezo. I think it could be very well be finished. This could be what we haven't witnessed for a very, very long time in UK politics, the death of a political party, and not just any political party, the UK Conservative Party, the most, as people often said, the most successful political party of any country in the world. So the fact that we are seeing that, well, once again, that was said about the Conservative Party, we are witnessing something monumental in the making, or in the happenings, shall we say. So back to this. Despite everything, he still now remains one figure that many believe can now reconnect with the voters who have drifted to Labour or even Reform. But amongst Reform UK voters, the picture is more muddled. With Johnson now and Robert Jerrick dividing support, although Jerrick at least pips him at the post by just 2%, the headline is still unmistakable that a significant slice of the party's most recent electorate still sees Boris as the man to lead them again. Insane, I know, but that is what the data says. Insane. This result now will only fuel further speculation of Johnson's comeback, the speculation which never, of course, really went away. Usually the assessment in Westminster is that Boris Johnson wants to come back. He'll make a return. Then you ask, how will he come back? And that answer isn't forthcoming. It would surely, of course, require a by-election for him to get adopted as a candidate. And then why? If the polling has, of course, been behind him, favouring both the current leadership in Badenoch and all the potential parliamentary challengers, why would they let him have a seat back at the table? Even then, if you ignore everything else, you just focus on the internal mess that is the party. Very true. Why would you allow a new rival into the game? You would never do that. None of these people who are looking to climb the pole, even Mel Street, the comedy candidate from the last Tory leadership election, I don't think he would even let Boris Johnson back in. So, looked at, of course, more broadly, this very same polling delivers, of course, a second message. When presented, of course, with a list of Tory figures and, of course, who would be asked to be best Conservative leader, the public's, of course, top option was none of them at 27%, and, of course, didn't know at 25%. A vote of no confidence, of course, in both individuals offered up, and likely, of course, the party itself. And that is just what Boris Johnson really ineffectively did to the party. The start of all this was, of course, the Brexit referendum and the aftermath that happened. Through Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss really being the final death knell, and then Rishi Sunak just doing nothing, pretty much. And this is now where the party is. And Kemi Badenoch isn't doing anything either. Robert Jenrick, if he gets in, he will just be bad in a lot of different worse ways. But will he be able to put up a defense against Nigel Farage? I don't think so. Like I say, why vote for imitation Farage when you can have the real Farage? So that is, of course, more of course, that is, of course, more than half of the respondents to the Ipsos poll. This now is effectively, of course, tapped out with the Tory leadership, not even itching even a comeback tour. This is an electorate now looking at the Tory lineup and shrugging, which instead should be really making the party think about having a good, hard look at itself in the mirror and thinking, what is this? What has happened? How did we get to this? But it daren't do that. We've said before about the inability of them to generally have a generous, like, retrospective look at themselves, their policies, how the past 14 years really went. They can't. They're just incapable of doing that. And it's going to lead to their eventual downfall. Are we in the end game yet? Maybe not. Maybe not quite yet, but it sure looks like we're on that way. So they've, of course, clocked off, and it is worse than the public. Still, of course, being annoyed. It is now hard to capture the attention of those who have turned their back on those who are angry. They just aren't listening to be won back. Johnson, of course, despite his name recognition, registers now with only 9% overall. But that still has him taking the top spot ahead of Badenoch in the general public's eyes. Amongst the 2024 Conservative voters, Badenoch and Johnson are effectively split at 16 and 17%. But then again, Rory Stewart still trails her by a single percent. If this is what the public thinks the party has in store, a former leader, a current one, and Rory Stewart, it doesn't necessarily bode well. It all speaks now to a very much broader issue, and that is that Badenoch's premiership has not landed with the public. Badenoch was meant to be the reset button, young, articulate, and not tainted by all the failures of her predecessors, but she was part of so many of their cabinets. All part of that. Yeah, and Badenoch did not hit the reset button. He pretended to press the reset button or pretended that something new was going on in the party and then never did that. Never did that at all. Instead, now only 6 in 10 cannot even name a single positive reason why she should be Prime Minister. From a list now of potential positive statements, if she were to become PM, only 13% actually selected that she would get immigration under control. And just 12% went on to say she would grow the economy. Among Conservatives themselves, faith now is founded less on specific policies than on belief. Comforting, but questionable. Yeah, questionable indeed. That the party, of course, now has a better record on running the country than Labour, of course, 34%. It, of course, may be, of course, tempting to be taken by this, that Johnson doing well in the polls and people looking at the Tories' record as positive. But that would, of course, be wise not to fall for it too quickly. Most recent common concern about potential Badenoch leadership is, of course, not about her personality qualities, but the party's recent record, with 30% saying that the Conservatives cannot be trusted after their previous time in office. That figure is now even higher amongst Labour voters at 44 and very substantial amongst Reform at 35. So you ain't winning back those Reform voters. That is very, very much baked in. Very, very much baked in at this point. So, among the Conservative voters, of course, in the last election, however, 21% think Badenoch is too inexperienced against Keir Starmer, who, when asked who would make a better Prime Minister, Badenoch, of course, still trails by 10 percentage points. Nigel Farage, despite his own high negatives, is now more likely than the Tory leader to be the preferred potential PM. As Karen Pedley says of Ipsos, this now latest polling shows the scale of the challenge of the Conservative opposition. Not only does Kemi Badenoch trail Keir Starmer, who the public thinks should be the better Prime Minister, but the party's only recent record in government is still now the single biggest barrier for voters. While Nigel Farage also features very highly negative ratings, he also currently holds a very narrow advantage over Badenoch in the eyes of the public, adding now another complex dynamic to an even wider opposition landscape. He then, of course, dryly notes, even amongst their own voters, there is no consensus on the path forward. That is, of course, Westminster code for nobody knows what to do. And that is the truth. That is still as it was ever since we were covering it from their election defeat. That is still the case as it was today. They have no clue what to do. And unless they take like serious action, that ain't gonna happen. So let's finish this off. It sees now the Tory party completely left adrift. None of its potential leaders inspire much confidence. All were who involved in the last series of governments, in least one way or another, causing now causing this loss of trust. Yet, all the now individual people are now looking for leadership. Not doesn't bode well at all for them, does it? This, of course, leaves the Johnson dilemma. Yes, among the core Tory voters, Johnson remains, of course, a top choice. But amongst the broader electorate, he commands little more support than anyone else. The hard truth that the Conservative Party must now face is that their crisis is not just about Badenoch or Johnson, Sunak or Cleverly. It is a crisis of trust and promises. Until the party can actually convince voters that it has learned from its years in power and offers something new, talk of leadership changes will be little more than a displacement activity. Johnson may still cast now the longest shadow, but a shadow cannot lead the party back into government. Very true indeed. There's a lot of Tories out there, I think, who are recognizing the problem that the party faces. And I think the two, as I've said before, the two like voices in the wilderness have always been David Gork and Rory Stewart. Now, will Rory Stewart ever return to politics? I don't know. I don't think he will. And then if he does get in, can he actually make the necessary changes to the party? Because, oh boy, do you have a lot of changes you need to make to the party. You need to ditch their ideology, which they have clung to for so long. What do you do about all these MPs that aren't exactly going to be loyal to you or say they're loyal? Meanwhile, of course, hiding the knives behind their back because still, um, you know, their regicidal tendencies have become pretty much baked into the party. How did you solve all that? What do you do, of course, about the Tory membership? Again, it is. I just think it is too huge a challenge. I think it is just too huge a challenge. I don't even think Rory Stewart can come in and save the party, even if it was like a David Stewart got ticket. No way. I think it's I think it's done. I think we are slowly but surely. Maybe it will take a couple of election cycles, but that's it. The end of the Tory party, and it is again. I must state this. This does not happen too often in British politics. The death of like a serious like political party. That's what we're looking at. So let me know what you think about all this. How long can they last for? I still think it'll be a good couple of years. We're not looking at like an imminent collapse. Um, who knows, right? It could be a couple of years. Give it maybe a decade, maybe. I know that's a long time, but hey, a lot of stuff can happen. Maybe after, I don't know, a reform government, people realize, oh, actually, yeah, Farage and that lot, we're not that good. But as always, thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think about all this. But yeah, it does not bode well that the Conservative Party membership, or at least a good proportion of them, still think that somehow Boris Johnson is the guy who can rescue them. Yeah, that's not good at all, is it?